Aaliyah Banks was 18 years old, 7 months into her first real job, and standing at her assigned post at Junction 8 to 12 of Northland Crossing Mall when Officer Millerthorne crossed the corridor and closed his gloved hand around her wrist. She wasn't running. She wasn't resisting. She was holding a clipboard and updating her morning log the way she did every Tuesday at this exact time, in this exact spot, in the same tan attendant uniform she had ironed the night before, badge pressed flat against her chest, plainly visible, 3 inches from his face when she held it up. He looked at it like it wasn't there. Around them, the mall corridor filled and slowed. Shopping bags stopped swinging. A man in a dark polo reached into his pocket and raised his phone without a word. The overhead fisheye camera at Junction 8 to 12 captured every second of it. The grip, the badge, the bystanders freezing in place. The expression on Aaliyah's face that took everything inside a person to hold together. That image was taken on a Tuesday morning. By noon, it was everywhere. By the end of the year, it cost one man his career, his certification, and $2.7 million, and gave one woman back something no verdict can fully name, but every person watching already understands. Before we go any further, if you believe that what happened to Aaliyah Banks deserves to be heard, hit that subscribe button right now. This channel exists to tell the stories that the news cycle covers for one day and then forgets. Aaliyah's story lasted 11 months in a courtroom. The least we can do is give it more than 30 seconds of attention. Subscribe, hit the bell, and stay with us, because this story is only just beginning. Aaliyah Banks had graduated from Crockett High School 4 months earlier. No fanfare, no big party, no senior trip. Just a diploma, a handshake from a principal she barely knew, and a plan she had already been building for 2 years before she walked across that stage. The plan was simple in the way that only disciplined plans are simple. Work the mall attendant job at Northland Crossing, save enough for tuition at Schoolcraft College, and study criminal justice. She had mapped it all out in a composition notebook she kept on her nightstand. Tuition costs broken down by semester. Estimated hours at her hourly rate. A target savings date circled in red marker. Below that, a note to herself in her own handwriting. Don't fall behind. Don't make excuses. Don't quit. She had written that last line, not because she was prone to quitting, but because she knew herself well enough to know that the temptation would come. The long shifts, the early mornings, the slow erosion of motivation that hits everyone eventually, and she wanted to have already answered it before it arrived. She wasn't naive. Growing up on the east side of Detroit taught you things that no classroom formalized, but every child absorbed anyway. How to read a room before you walked into it fully, how to gauge the temperature of a situation from across the street, how to carry yourself in a way that communicated precisely the right amount of confidence without tipping into the territory that made certain people uncomfortable. Aaliyah had learned all of it. She had grown up watching her mother navigate those calculations every single day, at the grocery store, at parent-teacher conferences, at the DMV, and she had internalized the arithmetic of it so deeply that it had become instinct. But she also believed, the way only someone who is 18 and has not yet been broken by a specific kind of experience can fully believe, that doing the job right, dressing the part, showing up without complaint, being unimpeachably professional, would be enough. That a badge meant something. That a uniform was a kind of armor. That the world, while imperfect, operated on some basic level of logic that would ultimately recognize effort and respond to it in kind. She had not yet learned what it cost to hold that belief. She was about to. Before she left that night, she stood in front of the bathroom mirror and tucked her badge into her shirt pocket with both hands, pressing it flat against her chest. She looked at herself for a long moment, took in the collar she had straightened twice, the shirt her mother had pressed until it was perfect, the face of a girl who had decided she was going to build something for herself out of whatever she could reach. She adjusted her collar one more time, nodded once at her own reflection. Her mom, Denise, called good night from the kitchen. Aaliyah called it back. She picked up her bag, checked that her radio charger was in it, and walked out into the Monday evening air. She had everything to lose. She had no idea how close she was to losing it. Aaliyah arrived at Northland Crossing at 7:15 that Tuesday, 45 minutes before the mall opened to the public, the way she always did. This was not required of her. Her shift technically began at 7:30, and her first assigned post check wasn't until 7:45. But she had started arriving early in her second week on the job and had never stopped, because she had discovered that the 15 minutes between 7:15 and 7:30 were some of the most useful of her entire day. The mall in those minutes was a different place entirely. Blue-gray and cathedral quiet, the overhead lights still warming up to full brightness, the stores behind their gated fronts like sleeping things, the floor polished to a shine that the foot traffic of a full day would gradually erase. She liked it. She liked the particular quality of a building before the public arrived, the sense that she was part of the infrastructure of the place, one of the people who made it ready rather than one of the people who simply used it. She walked her first corridor sweep with her boots soft on the polished floor, radio clipped and ready, clipboard under her arm. She knew this building the way you only know a place when you have spent 7 months inside it before most people are even awake. She knew which corridor lights flickered near the food court, second bank on the left, the one above the phone repair kiosk that maintenance had been promising to fix since October. She knew which service entrance near the loading dock stuck when it rained because the frame had warped and nobody had gotten around to replacing it. She knew which store managers liked a quick good morning and which ones needed their first coffee before any human interaction could reasonably be expected of them. Marcus at the electronics kiosk gave her a nod when she passed. He was always there early too, restocking display cases before the morning rush. Sandra from the accessories boutique 2 storefronts down called out her name and asked about her mother, the way she did every Tuesday, because Sandra had met Denise once during a visit and had decided on the spot that she liked her. Aaliyah answered warmly, said her mother was fine, kept moving. She had 3 more corridors to check before the main entrance unlocked, and the day's foot traffic began building from a trickle to a flood. She was good at this. She had worked hard to be good at this, and that was not a small thing. She took the job seriously in a way that some of her coworkers, older and more habituated to the rhythms of mall work, had long since stopped doing. She wrote her corridor logs in full, legible sentences rather than the shorthand abbreviations that were technically acceptable. She responded to her radio checks promptly and completely. When she encountered situations, a shoplifter, a medical event in the food court, a domestic argument near the parking entrance, she handled them with a composure and precision that her supervisor had noted twice in her file in the 7 months she had been there. She had a future in this, if she wanted it. She was building towards something bigger, but she was not treating this as temporary in the way that made people sloppy. It was a foundation. She was treating it like one. Miller Thorne arrived at 7:52, 8 minutes before shift technically required him to be at post. This was not, on its face, a problem, but the way he arrived told you something. He came in through the east service door without acknowledgement of the coordinator at the desk, didn't sign the log immediately the way protocol specified, exchanged no pleasantries with anyone he passed. He was broad-shouldered and unhurried in the particular way of a man who had long ago decided that the procedural expectations around him were suggestions applied to other people. His personnel lanyard hung loose at his chest rather than clipped at the standard position. His expression when he paused at the corridor junction and let his gaze move slowly across the space, the slight compression of his jaw, the deliberate, assessing quality of it, was not the expression of a man orienting himself to his shift. It was the expression of a man looking for something specific. He found it at 7:58. Aaliyah was near junction 8 to 12 with her back partially to him, updating her corridor log, pen moving, focused on the clipboard. She did not see him looking. She did not know she had been seen. 2 minutes passed. The ambient sounds of the mall shifted as the main entrance unlocked and the first shoppers of the morning began to move through the corridors. The timestamp clicked to 8 o'clock. He didn't call out to her. He didn't clear his throat or announce his approach or ask a question first. There was no "excuse me," no "hey, no, can I see your credentials?" Nothing that would have given her a moment to turn around and respond as a colleague, as a fellow member of staff, as another uniformed person in the same building doing her assigned job. Miller Thorne crossed the corridor in 8 deliberate strides and closed his gloved hand around Aaliyah Banks' wrist before she had fully registered that he was there. The contact was hard and certain. Not a tap, not a guiding touch, not the kind of grip that leaves room for misinterpretation. It was a restraining grip, the kind that communicates a single thing with absolute clarity. I have decided that you require handling, and I am the one who will handle you. Aaliyah's pen clattered to the floor. She felt the pressure of his hand before she understood what was happening, and in the half-second between sensation and comprehension, she reacted the only way her body knew how. She turned to look, and in turning, the overhead camera caught what moved across her face in the instant before she controlled it. Pure, un guarded shock. The expression of someone who has just been grabbed without warning in their own workplace in front of a filling corridor of strangers. She controlled it in under a second. That, too, the camera caught. Who authorized you to be at this post? His voice was flat and procedural, performing the cadence of official inquiry without any of its actual content. What's your role here? Who do you report to? Aaliyah's free hand moved immediately and deliberately to her badge. She lifted it toward him, held it steady, clear, 3 inches from his face, and said, in a voice that was even and measured and cost her considerably more than it sounded like it did, I'm a mall attendant. 7 months at this location. My badge number is right here. My supervisor is reachable on Channel 3. She did not pull against his grip. She did not raise her voice. She had been taught by 7 months of training and 18 years of living in a world that punished black women for reacting to provocations in any way that could be characterized as aggressive, to stay calm. She stayed calm. Thorne glanced at the badge the way you glance at something you have decided in advance doesn't count. His eyes moved to it and moved away, a gesture that was less dismissal than erasure. A look that said, not I've considered your evidence and found it insufficient, but rather your evidence is not a category of thing I am required to engage with. I need verbal confirmation from a supervisor through proper channels, he said. You don't move until I say. The corridor was filling around them with the particular speed of a Tuesday morning in a suburban mall. Strollers and retirees and teenagers, and people on their way somewhere else who had ducked in for the shortcut. A woman pushing a stroller veered wide when she registered the scene, staring as she passed. A teenager in a hoodie stopped walking entirely and stood watching with the unguarded directness of someone who hadn't yet learned to pretend not to look. A man in a dark polo near the pharmacy entrance, calm, quick, certain about what he was doing, reached into his jacket pocket and raised his phone. Aaliyah stood straight, badge still extended, eyes on Thorne's face with a steadiness that was not passivity. It was precision, the kind of self-possession that requires everything a person has and leaves marks you can't always see afterward. She did not look at the people watching. She kept her attention on the man in front of her and held the line of her own composure like it was the only thing she had left that was entirely hers. The camera above Junction 8 to 12 recorded everything. The grip, the badge, the phone going up in the background. Aaliyah's expression. Thorne's posture, certain, unhurried, utterly unmoved by a badged, uniformed young woman telling him clearly who she was and where she worked. Every second of it. Every single second preserved in black and white. By 8:05, the circle had grown without anyone making a decision to form it. It happened the way crowds always gather around something that announces itself as wrong before the mind has fully articulated the reason. People who had been in the middle of their own mornings, thinking about their own things, simply slowed and stopped and turned, pulled by the particular gravity of a public injustice that the human body recognizes before the brain has finished its analysis. Nobody said anything. Nobody organized. The ambient noise of them all, the soft recorded music cycling through the overhead speakers, the distant roll of a maintenance cart near the food court entrance, the low mechanical hum of the HVAC system doing its work in the ceiling, continued beneath the silence the crowd had collectively created around Thorne and Aaliyah, like a held breath that the whole corridor was holding together. Jerome Patton had come to Northland Crossing that morning to buy his sister a birthday gift. He was 34, a paralegal at a civil litigation firm in Dearborn, and he had been on his way to the bookstore at the mall's north end when the quality of the corridor changed around him and he looked up from his phone to find out why. He took in the scene in the efficient, categorizing way of someone whose professional life involved reconstructing events from evidence. A uniformed police officer, a young mall attendant in a matching uniform, a visible badge, a grip on a wrist, a crowd forming. He understood what he was looking at before he could have fully explained the reasoning. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his phone, and raised it to chest height without a word. Steady, deliberate, narrating quietly as he recorded in the low, precise voice of someone who understood that what mattered most right now was the completeness and accuracy of the record. He did not shout. He did not push forward into the scene. He did not do anything that could be characterized, later, as provocation or interference. He simply made sure it was being captured. Every angle he could reach, every second of Thorne's grip on Aaliyah's wrist, every moment she stood there holding her badge with the kind of quiet, exhausting dignity that people who have spent their lives preparing for exactly this kind of moment learn to perform even when it is costing them everything. At 8:07, a door to the left of junction 8 to 12 banged open with enough force that several people in the crowd flinched. Darren Cole came through it fast. The manager of the sporting goods anchor store whose glass frontage ran the entire length of that corridor. Still holding his morning inventory clipboard, his face already set in the expression of a man who has seen something on his floor camera that required him to stop what he was doing immediately. He was 52, had managed that store for 11 years, and had known Aaliyah Banks by name since her third week on the job. He had seen her badge every single morning. He had eaten lunch in the food court 2 tables from her. He knew exactly who she was and exactly what he was looking at. "Let her go." He said it loudly enough that the entire circle heard it, and the nearest people outside the circle heard it too. "She works here. I have personally seen her badge every single morning for 7 months. Let her go right now." Thorne turned toward him with the slow, measured patience of a man who finds being challenged useful rather than threatening, because it provides an opportunity to demonstrate the extent of his authority. "Sir," he said, "step back. This is an active security matter." "She works here," Darren said, and did not step back. "She's a mall attendant. She belongs at this post." There was a moment between them, Darren's jaw set, clipboard in hand, not moving, where the crowd seemed to collectively stop breathing. Thorne held Darren's gaze with that same flat, certain expression he had turned on Aaliyah's badge. Then he said, quieter, with a precision that made it clearly a warning rather than a request, "Sir, step back." Darren held his ground for 3 more seconds. Then he reached into his pocket with his free hand, pulled out his own phone, and began recording. That was the moment the crowd fully understood what it was doing. Not waiting, not hoping someone official would intervene. Bearing witness, deliberately and collectively, because each person standing in that circle had arrived independently at the same cold, furious conclusion. No authority in that corridor was going to stop this. Which meant the only thing left to do was make absolutely certain the world would see it. Phone screens glowed. Angles shifted. The record expanded. Aaliyah, at the center of all of it, kept her badge extended and her eyes forward and her composure intact, and gave the camera above junction 8 to 12 exactly what it needed to preserve. The truth of what was happening in high definition from above, in black and white, with a timestamp that would never be in dispute. The verification should have taken 30 seconds. 30 seconds. The time it would have taken someone with radio access to pull up the scheduling system, locate badge number at 2247, confirm active employment status, and relay that information back. That was it. That was the entire process. Aaliyah's badge number wasn't a live system. Her direct supervisor was reachable on Channel 3. Darren Cole was standing 6 feet away with 7 months of direct personal knowledge and a clipboard on which her name appeared on every single morning sign-in log going back to the day she started. Any one of those 3 sources in any combination could have resolved the question in the time it takes to make a phone call. Miller Thorne chose none of them. At 8:09, 9 minutes after he had first grabbed Aaliyah's wrist, with her still standing at her own post in her own uniform holding up her own badge, Thorne keyed his radio and requested what he formally described as a contractor credential verification through the primary contracting agency. This process, as the mall's operations manager would testify 11 months later, was not standard. It was not required for on-duty uniformed staff already displaying credentials. It had not been invoked for any other employee in the preceding 18 months of operations at Northland Crossing. It was, in the words of the operations manual Dana Osei, would eventually introduce into evidence, a procedure reserved for circumstances where there was documented reason to doubt the authenticity of presented credentials, which is to say, circumstances where the badge itself appeared fraudulent. Aaliyah's badge was not fraudulent. It was issued by the mall's contracting agency. It was registered in the live system. It was exactly what it appeared to be. Dispatch came back within 4 minutes with a straightforward employment confirmation. Thorne radioed again, said the confirmation was insufficient, and requested secondary verification from the contracting agency's central HR office. The central office, he was informed, opened at 9 a.m. So Aaliyah stood there, at her own station, in her own uniform, with her badge in her own hand. For 2 hours. She was not offered chair. She was not offered water, despite the fact that the corridor had a vending alcove 12 feet from where she stood. When she asked, twice in the first 40 minutes, to contact her direct supervisor by radio or phone, Thorne told her both times that the matter was being processed through the appropriate channels and that she needed to remain available at the scene. When she pointed out, quietly and precisely, that her supervisor's radio confirmation would satisfy the same requirement he was waiting on from the central office, Thorne did not respond. Patricia Holt, the mall's general manager, arrived at the junction at 8:45 after receiving a call from Darren Cole, who had, by that point, already compiled a folder of photographs and video on his phone. Patricia was not a woman who arrived at situations underprepared. She came with the scheduling printout, the contractor agreement on file, and a section of the mall operations manual that outlined the limits of individual officer authority in disputes involving contracted staff. She laid all of it out for Thorne in the precise, controlled tone of a woman making a formal record of a conversation rather than simply having one. Thorne listened to all of it. Then he told her to direct her concerns to his supervisory chain and turn his back on her. Patricia Holt stood very still. The people still gathered at the edges of the corridor watched her absorb what had just happened. Then she turned around, walked back toward her office, and picked up the phone to call an attorney. She would later say, in her deposition, that she had never in 11 years of mall management seen a contracted officer refuse a direct instruction from senior management on the property. She had also, she said, never seen a credential check invoked against a uniformed employee whose badge was visibly authentic and whose employment was verbally confirmed by both a department manager and dispatch. She had known, standing in that corridor, that something was happening that went beyond procedure. She had just not yet known how far it would go. At 9:17, Denise Banks' phone rang in Detroit. Aaliyah had waited until she was certain she could keep her voice level before she called. She told her mother what was happening in the same measured, factual way she reported everything difficult, not minimizing it, but containing it because she knew what her mother's panic sounded like, and she did not have the bandwidth to manage it while also managing herself. Denise heard everything Aaliyah said. She also heard, underneath the evenness of her daughter's voice, the thing Aaliyah was not saying. She was in her car in under 8 minutes. She drove 45 miles in 39. She arrived at the mall's main entrance at 10:04, breathless, coat half-zipped, scanning the corridor with the particular focus of a mother who knows which direction her child is in trouble. She found the junction. She found the crowd, diminished now, but still present. She found Thorne. And she found Aaliyah, still standing exactly where she had been standing for 2 hours, back straight, badge straight, face composed in that specific terrible way that Denise recognized immediately because she was her mother and she had taught her daughter that composure herself, and she knew exactly what it cost. At 10:10, Thorne acknowledged the central office confirmation that had finally come through and released Aaliyah from the hold. He offered no apology, no acknowledgement of what had just occurred, no eye contact. He simply stated that the matter was resolved, unkeyed his radio, and began walking toward the east corridor as if 2 hours had not just passed, as if a young woman had not just stood at her own post being detained without cause while her mother drove across a state line to reach her. Denise got to Aaliyah in 4 steps and pulled her close. Aaliyah let herself be held for a long moment, with her eyes closed, her composure briefly and privately suspended. Then she straightened up, smoothed her uniform, looked at her mother. "I'm okay," she said. She was not okay, but she would be. Eventually, expensively, publicly, she would be. Jerome Patton posted his video at 11:43 a.m. from his kitchen table, still in the jacket he'd been wearing at the mall. He wrote 4 sentences, precise, plain, without embellishment. He described what he had witnessed, named the location, explained that the woman in the video was a uniformed, badged mall attendant going about her assigned duties, and said that he was posting because he believed people should see what had happened. He tagged the local Detroit news station. He put his phone down and made lunch. He would later describe the next 2 hours as the strangest experience of his professional life. A paralegal who dealt in documentation and evidence suddenly watching a piece of documentation he had created become its own kind of event. By noon, the video had 40,000 views. By 1 o'clock, it had crossed 100,000, and the tags were multiplying: journalists, activists, local politicians, national commentators. By 2 p.m., it was at 250,000 and climbing, and the Detroit Free Press had already reached out to him twice. By the time their digital piece ran at 4:30, with a still frame from the footage as the header image, Thorne's gloved hand and Aaliyah's badge, both unmistakably visible. The image had been screenshotted and reshared so many times across so many platforms that the original post had become almost incidental. The image existed independently now. It belonged to the internet, which meant it belonged to everyone, which meant it belonged to no one, least of all the 18-year-old mall attendant who had been standing inside it. Aaliyah found out the way you find out about things that have already outrun your ability to control them, from someone else's reaction to something you haven't seen yet. Her mother's phone started going off first, in the passenger seat of Denise's car in the mall parking lot, a persistent and escalating series of notifications that Denise kept silencing and then giving up on silencing. Then Aaliyah's own phone. She looked at the screen and did not immediately understand the scale of what she was looking at. Then she clicked through to the news piece. Then she saw herself, her own face, her own badge, Thorne's hand on her wrist, on the screen of a cable news program being described by an anchor in the clipped, authoritative tone of national breaking news coverage. She watched it the way you watch something that is simultaneously entirely about you and completely removed from you. The person on that screen was her. Same uniform, same badge, same face she had looked at in the bathroom mirror the night before. And also wasn't only her, because the story the anchor was telling was larger than the specific morning she had just lived through. It had already been transformed into a symbol, a data point, a moment in a pattern, which was true. She understood that it was true. It was also its own strange violence, to have your worst moment become public property before you had finished having it. Her notifications were in the thousands by the time she scrolled to the top. Messages from strangers who were outraged on her behalf, supportive and furious, and sometimes painfully performative. Messages from people who had already decided she was lying, or had provoked it, or was exploiting it. Messages that were kind in ways that felt intrusive. Messages that were hostile in ways she forced herself not to finish reading. Somewhere in the flood, messages from actual people she knew, friends, former classmates, her aunt in Lansing, but they were indistinguishable from a noise except that they used her nickname. Her name had belonged to her yesterday. Today, it belonged to a news cycle. Tomorrow, it would belong to whatever the news cycle became next. She had no mechanism to stop any of it, and the understanding of that, the sheer, vertiginous lack of control, settled over her in the passenger seat of her mother's car like a second assault on top of the first one. She turned her phone face down on her knee, looked out the windshield at the mall entrance. The same door she had unlocked herself that morning in the blue-gray quiet before anyone else arrived, when the building had been hers, and she had been good at her job, and the day had been ordinary in every way that mattered. "I just want to do my job," she said, quietly, not to her mother, not really to anyone. Said in the particular way of someone trying to hold onto the version of the day that should have existed, The version where doing everything right was enough. Denise reached across and put her hand over her daughter's and kept it there. Outside in the parking lot, people walked past the car in both directions, none of them knowing that the woman whose face was currently on television screens across 3 time zones was sitting 30 feet from them in a Nissan Altima with her phone face down on her knee, trying to figure out how to be a private person inside a story that had decided it didn't need her permission to continue. The video kept spreading. Dana Osei watched the video twice, back to back, without pausing. Then she opened a new document on her computer, typed 4 lines of notes, closed the document, and picked up her phone. She found the number the Detroit Free Press had included in their piece for the Banks family. She called it at 6:22 p.m., less than 7 hours after Jerome Patton had posted his recording, less than 9 hours after Thorne had closed his hand around a uniformed 18-year-old's wrist at her own post. She left a message that was brief and specific: who she was, what she had seen, why she was calling, and what she believed could be done. She did not oversell it. Dana Osei had practiced civil rights law in Michigan for 15 years and had long since stopped needing to persuade clients that their cases were strong, because she had also long since stopped taking cases that weren't. She had watched 37 seconds of corridor footage and known, with the particular certainty of someone who has built a career on reading evidence, exactly what she was looking at. Aaliyah called back the next morning. They met 4 days later. The conference room in Dana's downtown Detroit office was small and spare, pale walls, a long table, a window that looked out over the river toward Windsor. Dana was 41 and possessed a quality that Aaliyah noticed immediately and would think about afterward. She was the angriest calm person Aaliyah had ever been in a room with. Her composure was total, and her fury was total, and they occupied the same space in her simultaneously, the way certain people carry contradictions that would unravel someone less disciplined. She had represented a school district employee wrongfully terminated in Oakland County, a healthcare worker racially harassed at a hospital in Washtenaw County, and 2 plaintiffs in federal civil rights actions. She knew what a viable case felt like in a room. This one felt like one of the strongest she had seen. Aaliyah came in the way she came into everything, back straight, hands folded, voice even. She walked Dana through the timeline without editorializing. The arrival time, the timestamp on the footage, the exact words Thorne had used, the badge she had held up and watched him disregard, the 2 hours at her own station, the central office that hadn't opened until 9 o'clock, the general manager he had turned his back on the moment her mother arrived. She was precise and thorough in the way of someone who has spent considerable effort since the incident organizing the facts of it into a shape she could control, because the fact were the one part of what happened that she could still own. Dana let her finish without interrupting. Then she said, "I want you to understand something clearly before we go any further. What you're describing is not just an isolated incident of poor judgment or bad protocol. What you're describing has a name, and that name is a documented pattern." She opened the folder she had prepared before the meeting and slid it across the table. Thorne's personnel file, obtained through a preliminary records request, was clean in the way that certain files are clean only because someone has worked to keep them that way. 3 prior complaints, 3 separate incidents, 3 separate commercial properties across a 4-year window, each involving a black employee, each raising allegations that bore a structural resemblance to what had happened to Aaliyah at Junction 8 to 12. The first had been resolved with a small internal settlement and a non-disclosure agreement. The second had been reviewed, classified as within officer discretion, and closed. The third complainant, a 24-year-old inventory clerk at a distribution center in Livonia, had withdrawn after learning what it would cost in time and money and emotional exposure to pursue it without an attorney. 3 incidents, 3 closed files, 3 people who had encountered Miller Thorne and come away with a story that closely resembled Aaliyah's, and who had been processed through channels designed, whether intentionally or not, to ensure those stories stayed quiet. Aaliyah read through each complaint summary carefully. She did not rush. When she looked up, something had shifted in her expression. Not shock, because she had suspected something like this existed, but a particular cold clarity that comes from having a suspicion confirmed in documentary form. She looked at Dana across the table. "I don't want to settle," she said. Dana had been a litigator for 15 years. She had heard those words before, from clients who meant them and from clients who thought they meant them until the deposition process began and the opposing attorneys started their work. She looked at Aaliyah, 18 years old, 7 months out of high school, still wearing the posture of a person who had decided long before this meeting that she was not going to be moved by things that wanted to move her, and she believed her. "Then we go to jury," she said. The composition notebook on Aaliyah's nightstand had a circled target date for her schoolcraft tuition savings. She hadn't looked at it since the Tuesday the world had changed, but something shifted in her chest in that conference room that afternoon. Not relief, not triumph, nothing as simple as either of those, but something harder and more durable and more sustainable than fear. Something that felt, for the first time in 4 days, like forward motion. The courtroom was at capacity on the morning the surveillance footage played, and had been since the doors opened. Dana had subpoenaed the complete, unedited corridor recording from Junction 8 to 12. Not the 37-second clip Jerome Patton had posted, which had by now been viewed 11 million times across platforms, but the full continuous feed from the moment Thorne stepped through the e-service door to the moment Patricia Holt turned and walked back toward her office to call a lawyer. 4 minutes and 51 seconds of unbroken, time-stamped, fisheye lens black and white footage. It played on a screen visible to the judge, the jury, and the gallery without narration, without pause, without commentary. Just the raw record of what the camera had seen. The jury watched Thorne's approach, all 8 strides of it, unhurried, deliberate, the body language of a man who had already made his decision before he crossed the floor. They watched his gloved hand close around Aaliyah's wrist. They watched her immediate, composed response, badge raised, voice even, no panic, no aggression, just a young mall attendant identifying herself in a situation that should never have required her to do so. They watched Thorne's eyes move to the badge and away. They watched Aaron Cole come through the door and get waved back. They watched Aaliyah stand there at her own post for the remainder of the clip, holding herself together with a discipline that was visible in every frame. For minutes and 51 seconds, nobody in the courtroom moved. Thorne's defense built its case on the word routine. His attorney used it 11 times across 2 days of direct testimony and cross-examination. Routine verification, routine protocol, routine exercise of officer discretion, constructing with evident care an architecture of procedure around conduct that the footage showed plainly was not procedural. They brought in a mall security industry consultant who testified at length about the legitimacy of contractor credential verification as a standard tool in commercial operations. They argued that Thorne had operated within the reasonable and documented scope of his authorized role, that nothing he had done exceeded the discretionary authority of a contracted security officer, and that the outcome, however regrettable, reflected a process that had, by all formal measures, worked as designed. Dana dismantled it methodically, the way she dismantled everything. Not with theatrics, but with evidence stacked so precisely that the architecture of the defense collapsed under its own weight as each brick was removed. Patricia Holt testified first. She told the jury, calmly and precisely, that in 11 years of managing Northland Crossing, she had never seen a credential check invoked against an on-duty, uniformed mall attendant displaying valid credentials. Not once. She testified that she had personally confirmed Aaliyah's employment status, by name and badge number, to Thorne's face at 8:45 a.m., and that he had responded by turning his back on her. She testified that she had subsequently reviewed the operations manual to determine whether Thorne had any procedural basis for his actions and had found none. The scheduling coordinator confirmed that badge at 22:47 had been live in the system and accessible via radio query since Aaliyah's first day of employment. The contracting agency's HR director testified that no secondary verification request from an on-site officer had ever been processed through their central office before, that the process Thorne had invoked existed, technically, but had never been used in the manner he had used it and was not designed for circumstances where primary verification was already available. Jerome Patton testified about what he had seen and why he had recorded it. He was precise and unremarkable on the stand in the best possible way. A paralegal who had witnessed something, documented it accurately, and was now describing it without embellishment. The jury watched his version of the footage. Then the three prior complainants took the stand. Their names were Marcus Del Rey, Simone Achebe, and a woman who requested anonymity and testified behind a privacy screen. Each described an encounter with Miller Thorne at a different commercial property, in a different year, with the same essential structure. A black employee at their assigned post, credentials visible, confronted without cause, held beyond any reasonable verification period, released without apology or explanation. 3 incidents, 3 people, 3 files that had been quietly managed in a silence. The jury heard all 3 of them, and in hearing them heard the pattern that Thorne's defense had spent 2 days arguing did not exist. Aaliyah took the stand on the 4th day of trial. She did not perform. She did not arrive at the podium with a speech prepared or a persona constructed for the occasion. She sat down, adjusted the microphone, looked at the jury, and told them what had happened. She described the grip, the hardness of it, the specific quality of contact that was not procedural but proprietary, that communicated ownership rather than authority. She described the badge she had held up and watched him look through. She described the 2 hours, not as an abstraction, not as a legal concept, but in the specific experiential texture of what it meant to stand at her own post in her own uniform and knowing with complete certainty that she had done nothing wrong and being held anyway, by a man who had decided that her credentials were not a category of evidence he was required to acknowledge. She described the moment her mother arrived. She described turning her phone face down in the car. She spoke for 22 minutes, in the same even, controlled voice she had used to report the incident to Dana in that small conference room downtown. When she finished, she looked at the jury once more, then at her hands on the witness stand railing, then back at Dana. The courtroom was completely, entirely still. The jury was out for 3 hours and 50 minutes. Aaliyah spent most of that time in the small anteroom outside the courtroom with her mother and Dana, drinking bad coffee from a vending machine down the hall and not talking much. She had her jacket folded on the chair beside her, and in the inside pocket of it, where she could feel the slight weight of it when she moved, was her badge. She had carried it every day of the trial. Not on her uniform. She wasn't working, but in her pocket, present close. She couldn't have explained it precisely if asked. It was not a superstition, and it was not a performance. It was more that the badge was the thing Thorne had tried to make not count, and she needed it near her while the counting was happening. At 2:47 p.m. on the 9th day of proceedings, the jury sent word that they had reached a verdict. The courtroom reassembled with the speed of a room that had been waiting for exactly this. Aaliyah sat between her mother and Dana at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded in front of her, her spine straight, her face set in the particular composure she had carried since the morning of August 12th, the composure that had cost her so much and that she had refused to surrender even when it would have been entirely understandable to do so. She felt the weight of the badge in her jacket pocket. She did not reach for it. She sat still and waited. The foreperson stood and read the verdict in a measured, deliberate voice that withheld its meaning until the last possible moment, the way verdicts always do. The preamble, the findings, the legal language that builds the structure before it places the number inside it. And then the number. $2,700,000 in compensatory and punitive damages, awarded to the plaintiff, Aaliyah Marie Banks. Denise made a sound that was not quite a word, something between a gasp and the exhale of a breath she had been holding since a Tuesday morning in August. Dana set her pen down on the legal pad in front of her, with a precision that was itself a kind of emotion, carefully controlled. Aaliyah sat still for a long moment. Then she closed her eyes. Then she opened them and looked at the table in front of her and let the number settle into the space where the 2 hours had been, where the grip had been, where the look through the badge had been. She let it land. Miller Thorne's contractor certification was revoked by the licensing board within the week, following a formal complaint filed by the contracting agency on the basis of the trial record. His employer terminated his contract the same afternoon the verdict was read, in a letter that used the phrase "conduct inconsistent with the standards of the organization," and said nothing else of substance. Thorne did not speak publicly at any point during or after the trial. His attorney released a 2-sentence statement indicating that his client respectfully disagreed with the verdict and was evaluating options. No appeal was filed. On the courthouse steps, in the flat gray light of a Michigan afternoon that smelled faintly of rain, Aaliyah stood between her mother and Dana Osei, while reporters called out questions and cameras positioned themselves, and the world briefly organized itself around her for the second time in the same year. She did not deliver a speech. She had not prepared one and had not wanted to. She stood in the cold air and breathed it and let her mother take her hand and held it. And after a long moment, when the questions kept coming and the cameras kept finding her face, she said quietly to her mother, to Dana, to the specific Tuesday morning in August that had set all of this in motion, okay. Just that. One word. The sound of someone who has finished holding something very heavy and is setting it down, not in defeat, but in completion. 6 months later, Aaliyah Banks was enrolled in the criminal justice program at Schoolcraft College. The composition notebook on her nightstand had a new entry below the circled tuition target date, the date of first enrollment, written in the same neat, deliberate handwriting as everything else, underlined once. She was interning 2 days a week with a community oversight board in Wayne County that reviewed use of force complaints and conduct record for contracted personnel, work that she had sought out specifically that used exactly the knowledge the previous year had given her in the most expensive possible way. On Thursday evenings, she drove back to the east side and ran a mentorship session for teenage girls from her neighborhood who were interested in careers in law, public service, and civil rights. Girls who were 16 and 17 and standing at the edge of a world that was not going to slow down or make room for them simply because they deserved it to. She talked to them about the job. She talked to them about documentation and what it means to create a record. She talked to them carefully and specifically about what it costs to hold your composure when every instinct you have is telling you to do something else, and why it matters that you hold it anyway, and what you do with the anger afterward, so it doesn't become the thing that defeats you before anyone else gets the chance. She always wore her badge to those sessions. She always made sure the girls saw it. The actual physical badge, pinned straight to her shirt, number visible exactly as it had been on the morning of August 12th when she had held it 3 inches from Miller Thorne's face and watched him decide it didn't count. It still counted. It had always counted. But now she understood, in the cellular, irreversible way that you only understand things you have learned through your own body, what it meant to earn one. Not the earning that happens in training, but the other kind, the kind that happens when the world tests whether you will put it down, and you don't. And it costs you 2 hours in a viral moment and 11 months of litigation and 22 minutes on a witness stand in a room full of strangers. And at the end of all of it, you are still standing, badge still straight, composure still intact. And the number the jury gives you is the world way of finally, formally, publicly acknowledging what the badge said all along. She had been right. She had always been right. It had just taken $2.7 million for everyone else to agree. If you made it to the end of this story, you already know why it matters. Aaliyah Banks didn't go viral because she wanted to. She went viral because a camera was in the right place at the right time, and because enough people decided that what they were seeing deserved to be seen by more people. That's exactly what you can do right now. Share this video with one person. Leave a comment below telling us what part of Aaliyah's story stayed with you. And if you haven't subscribed yet, do it now, because there are more stories like this one sitting in court records and personnel files and composition notebooks on nightstands in Detroit, and we're going to tell every single one of them. The bell icon is right there. Use it. We'll see you in the next one.